I'm supposed to introduce the discussion with a few remarks, but then I think we have plenty of voices in the audience that should come in. So I want just a few remarks rather than a systematic discussion of what you have told us. The first is the following. I mean, what this whole discourse is about is the question of who owes what to others for what reasons. How can you develop reasons why A should share his or her resources with B? A and B may be individuals, there may be countries, there may be nations, there may be groups within countries, whatever. A and B can also be one single actor and the entire rest of mankind. And one of the most sophisticated and most influential answers to that question is the difference principle, right? That Rawls famously developed. However, we run into the following dilemma here. Empirically speaking, or sociologically speaking, it is clearly the case that the narrower the horizon of redistribution, the greater the willingness of people is to be taxed or to donate or to share their resources. A standard example in the European Union is that German taxpayers are much more willing to subsidize Bavarian family farms than Andalusian olive growers. Proximity increases solidarity, and solidarity declines with distance. This is, I think, as an empirical generalization, true. On the other side, if we do not look at empirical patterns of behavior, but at criteria of rationality, and supposing that you have 100 euros to donate or to tax, it is much more efficient in terms of the of poverty relief if you donate these 100 euro that you have to someone in Bangladesh compared to someone in Cyprus, right? It's much more needed in Bangladesh, or the marginal increase of, or the marginal relief of poverty is much greater if you send it to Bangladesh. So what do you do with this contradiction between empirical inclinations to tax or to be taxed and these standards of rationality, the best investment? One question. The next question is the following, and then I'm almost done. I mean, underlying your distinction and your discussion is a distinction between ethnos and demos. Ethnos as a collectivity that is shaped and inspired by a common history, a common language, a common religion, a common culture. And that is a solid base for reciprocity within a given set of relations, given in the sense that it cannot be denied. It is a homogeneity on which both roles in his more communitarian inclinations and John Stuart Mill, on whom to whom he refers, rely. On the other hand, you have the solidarity, much invoked these days in Europe, although not in the speech by President Gauck, that is based upon rights and rules and citizenship and the agora, a solidarity that is based upon a political rather than an ethical or based on Sittlichkeit community. And then thirdly, you have something that you refer to by quoting Jerry Cohen, which is a distributive principle based upon what is it called, a community of justification, right? Justificatory community, right? It's much broader than a demos, and certainly much broader, much wider than an ethnos. It borders on cosmopolitanism, but it is not clear that the entire mankind is involved in that. How do you argue for duties of sharing, duties of redistribution in that context, which is arguably the most relevant? That is still to be defined. The universalism that goes beyond a constituted political community, such as the European Union. Right? It is not clear to me how what the justifications in this justificatory community actually are. And then final questions I would like to bring up, namely the very complicated and hardly distinguishable mix between arguments from duty and arguments from consequences or self-interest. In the European Union today, calls for solidarity are supported by two kinds of arguments. First, a demos-based argument. We have a political community, constituted rights, citizenship, and so on. But also it is not just our duty to share resources, it is also smart to share resources, because if we fail to do so, we will trigger domino effects that in the last analysis will eventually affect us. That is, we destroy the markets if we fail to practice solidarity, on which we will depend in the future. Right? This is smartness rather than duty. And how do you deal with this ambiguity in the European context, and how likely is it that you find motivating reasons for sharing that apply and unfold an effectiveness, even if the smartness argument does not work, right? If you have an unclear mix of smartness and duty, or consequentialist and deontic arguments, then you can live on this. But if a situation prevails, as it arguably prevails in EU relation to Cyprus now, where it does not matter for reasons of consequences, but still a demand is made in terms of duties. What do you do then? How do you justify duties in such cases where the two types of support can be separated? Okay, let me leave it at that. Maybe you want to say something briefly, and then we open it up.
I certainly want to reply to this question, but if I start doing so now, it risks taking up the whole time. So perhaps we should take a few questions, and then I'll. But I won't forget these.
So the floor is open. Who wants to come in?
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I have a question concerning the 4 different views you presented on social justice and the EU. Well, my own inclination is actually that none of the 4 is the right view, and I wonder what your view about the 4 views are. I had also the feeling that you didn't really defend one of the 4, and it seems that there must be something like a 5th or a 6th view that captures better the essence of the EU and the requirements of social justice that follow from that than the 4 views you presented. So I'm very curious.
What is it?
Well, I'm the questioner. No, I mean, one way, I mean, it seems that the 4 views are based on a binary coding. It's either you have social justice or you have none, or just duty of assistance or humanitarian claims. But couldn't it be the case that the social justice goes in spheres, a nearer sphere with more requirements of social justice, let's say the family, and then the state, and then the EU, and then the global state, something of that sort, and then that they have different varieties, and those also all claims of social justice, and that could, I haven't really worked that out, but could capture some of the questions that Claus Offe posed to you.
Others. Yeah, please.
Could you elaborate a bit on the 6th of your 6 points that you skipped, language and Europe?
Okay. Okay, should
Ulrich?
Yeah.
Ulrich Preuss.
Well, I have a question which is maybe prior to the distributive issue. Namely, when I share something, I suppose that what I share is mine. It's not yours. It's not the property or the right of those with whom I'm supposed to share. Now the question is, you didn't raise that question because there are some theories, I think, which challenge the legitimacy of what we are supposed to share. For instance, when you mentioned the relationship between Germany and Greece, for instance. So then the Germans say, well, we have good reasons not to share, or others say we have good reasons to share, out of reason of duty or maybe even smartness, as Claus said. But I wonder whether we couldn't say, well, after all, as a European Union, we are in a cooperative scheme with Greece. The wealth of Germany is based on the cooperation with Greece. So in other words, we cannot say that everything all returns, so to speak, of our economic actions in Germany are owned by us or legitimately attributed to us as the right of us to freely decide whether we share or not. So I wonder whether that issue is something which has an importance for your argument.
Okay. Maybe I'll reply to, otherwise I'll be drowned under the question. So I'll connect then each of the 3 questions just asked to some of the things which Claus said. First, and so it's what do we owe to whom and to what extent, etc. And so my fundamental answer is that on grounds of justice, and so a just world is one in which the situation of the worst off worldwide is sustainably maximized. And so that means that your second suggestion there in this question about where should the redistribution go as a matter of priority, it should go to the very worst off in the world. But this is about just institutions, not about my charitable use of my own money. The question is, what sort of institutions should we develop worldwide in order to achieve this in a sustainable way? And therefore, so the priority for us may not be to dismantle the German welfare state as much as we can to the benefit of the people in Burundi or in the Congo, because what we need to achieve, and we can only do so stepwise, I mean national level, then European level, and other people elsewhere in the world, is a set of institutions that would eventually then encompass the whole world. And therefore, although this priority which you may have on grounds of charity with your own money is not necessarily the same as the one which we need in terms of institution building. Now, what underlies that, and perhaps I should state that explicitly, then in reply also to your question about isn't there a gradient in a way, a sort of a matter of degree with a multiplicity of duties of justice at the various levels. Well, as I briefly stated without justifying it, my conception of egalitarian conception of justice goes all the way to all the people who are linked by this justificatory community, and that is practically essentially the whole world today. How is it justified? Well, in Rawlson fashion, it's what he calls my own reflective equilibrium, the way in which my principles square with my own considered judgments. And a simple way, a very short way of sort of spelling out this intuition is one I use also in chapter 1 of my book on linguistic justice, and it's what I call my Stanley experience. It's when I was in Nigeria and I met this group of children around me as I was leaving to take the plane to come back to Europe, and then one of the little children who I called Stanley, because nearly all the little Nigerians there seem to be called Stanley. So he said, I want to go. I said, I have to go now, I have to take my plane. He said, I want to go with you. And I said, no, you can't come with me because your mummy will never want you to come with me. And he said, no, my mummy would like me to come with you because we know that Belgium, they believe that Belgium is a city in Germany where all the good second-hand cars come from in Nigeria. So Belgium is a very affluent place, and his mummy wanted him to go to Belgium. And then I stuttered some sort of bad justification, which I felt guilty. I thought it was a fair question, and I didn't give a good answer. And in fact, the fundamental thing there is that I was there with speaking a language that was neither my mother tongue nor his mother tongue, and having a real conversation, and then his being entitled to ask me, why do you have so much and me so little? And so that turns him into a member of my justificatory community, and what prevents him from having the same possibilities as me was the sheer fact that he was born beyond a certain border with a different citizenship and so on. And so my view is that it kicks in all the way. That is, there is no, and we can try to build all sorts of fences, etc., in order to protect ourselves against the radical conclusion that justice fundamentally must be global justice, and that the sort of justifications for inequality that are good enough for the people born next door to us the sort of justifications that are good enough for my Stanley must also be good enough for the people born next to me. And so, therefore, I believe it goes all the way. So I'm a monist in this sense. As soon as these two relations apply, common basic structure and justificatory community. But of course, you are absolutely right that in the way we are going to sort of implement that in our institutions, there will be a significant degree of decentralization, and there will be a subsidiarity, if you want, including all the way to in the good old sense of subsidiarity, all the way to the responsibilities of parents towards their children, etc. And so there is a whole set of moral and legal duties that will be highly differentiated and that will not be the same at these various levels. But this is not the fundamental ethical level. This is really pragmatic considerations that will lead us to give greater or less meaning to particular borders, to institutions on particular scales. So that's my central answer to that question. Then, of course, then in order to move in that direction, we must be fully aware of the sort of empirical facts which Claus mentioned, the fact that solidarity is easier to make politically acceptable and sustainable between Westies and Aussies than between Germans and Greeks. And so does that mean that this should be is this an ethically relevant consideration? No, it's a pragmatic consideration. And therefore, there is in the communitarian discussion often a confusion between two questions. And that was my question 2 and my question 4. That is, the conditions under which a particular conception of justice, a demanding conception of justice, makes sense as an ethical demand, and the conditions under which it is achievable, given the facts of life, including the fact that people who share a culture, who share an identity, find it easier to redistribute to each other. And so my own view is that, therefore, whatever we can do pragmatically in order to help achieve justice must be done, but not at the expense of justice. And so one of the things which I wanted to say then in the final parts, and that is connected then to the language issue, is that justice is not only distributive justice. It's also, that's something I developed in final parts of my book on linguistic justice, which is about to be published in German there. And I think the German translator of the book said he might be, he's there. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for the very hard and good work you did on it. It's going to be published by Zoerkamp probably in a couple of months or so. And but in that the final parts, so that's something that's completely absent from my earlier book. I developed this interpretation of justice as parity of esteem, and on grounds of parity of esteem, we'll need in Europe to protect our languages, and that is to have constraints, coercive sort of laws on the use of language in public education and public communication that will durably protect our language diversity. Not because linguistic diversity is good in itself, I don't think it's good in itself, but because it's required by this parity of esteem. Because of this persistent linguistic diversity in Europe, we'll never form an ethnos, we Europeans, an ethnos or a nation in a strong sense. And therefore, we'll never be able to bank, to count as much as one has been able to do in pretty homogeneous nation states on these spontaneous feelings of solidarity and of fellow feeling. And that will need to be taken into account. But of course, my bet is that by having a demos that is strong enough, without having this common ethnos, of course, a European demos that's superposed, that supplements the national demoid, that's not a full substitute for it, by having a demos that's strong enough, and that requires a common language, practicables English, by having a demos that's strong enough, you create conditions for strong redistribution, that for a generous redistribution, even in the absence of this spontaneous fellow feeling. Maybe somewhat more fragile, but it is nevertheless possible. Why? Because this common demos is not only a place where you argue and where you are forced to give justifications, where not only the Stanleys, but the Prime Minister of Greece and so on are there to say, yes, but I want my fair share. So it's a space of deliberation, but it's also a space of mobilization, a demos. And of course, our welfare states, they didn't grow out of just the generous feelings of the rich who felt this empathy with their fellow brothers and sisters who were poor. They were also they were the result of struggles and by trade unions, by the labor movement, by the people who represent the worst off, and who could do so at the national level because they could communicate cheaply and efficiently enough with each other. In Europe, we have this major obstacle, also obstacle to trust with each other, that is our language diversity. We need to overcome that. And that's part of what it means to have a common demos. And so my perspective, and so the major steps towards social justice at the European level, and of course even more at the global level, will be possible, not thanks to the emergence of a common ethnos, but thanks to the emergence of a common demos. Finally, then, this indicates, then there's the question about the consequentialist arguments, and yeah, no, I should not quite finally. Penultimate remark, and then there's still Ulrich's question. So, and so there was Klaus's third question, which was about the sort of consequentialist arguments in favor of redistribution. As I mentioned at the end of my talk, I'm an opportunist, and so there can be arguments that are invoked in terms of enlightened self-interest, to say we need to put into place a genuine redistributive system at the European level, and it may wrongly or falsely be inspired by the self-interest of each of the components. This is not fundamentally different from what happened in the rise of our welfare states. Of course, much of in our welfare states is an insurance mechanism where people, some relatively well off, people protected themselves against certain risks without wanting to have any ex-ante redistribution. But the logic of this sort of development led gradually to an extension and to a significant degree of ex-ante redistribution. So and whatever the motives, including the solidarité de fait mentioned by Monnet in the founding documents of the first European communities, and so through this idea that protecting each other may also protect ourselves in the long term. This is an important motive, and we shouldn't poo-poo it because it's not altruistic. We should mobilize it and use it. And then finally, of course, and that's a very important point, which is then really about what it is that distributive justice is there to distribute. And first of all, it's important to make a distinction between what I have a duty to do with what I justly own, and, for example, to be charitable or to be humanitarian aid, and what I have to give away to someone else because I don't owe it, and it justly belongs to someone else. And the question is, what is it that belongs truly to me, what belongs to others, and therefore I need to give. It looks as if it's mine, but it's not really mine because it belongs to others. And there you have two deep ambiguity pointed out in particular by Brian Barry in John Rawls's work, in part also of that tradition, which is, in one view, there is really ultimately distributive justice is a matter of cooperative justice. And there are some formulations in Rawls that go clearly in this sense, in the sense that what you are sharing is just the benefits of social cooperation, and you have to distribute that in a fair way. Rawls, in defense against the libertarians, then say, yes, but we owe so much to others that, in fact, what we could have done just on our own is nothing. So we might as well forget it. That is because we can only do things because of language which other people learned, because of et cetera, and so we might as well redistribute the whole lot. But this is true for an individual, but of course if you think about nations, it's not so obvious anymore. And there you can think about the benefits of social cooperation as being only part of what you can do, of what you happen to have by way of income. Whereas on the individual level, you can say, well, everything is due to cooperation. If you speak about the whole country, not everything is due to cooperation with other countries. And therefore, so it's not that surprising that Rawls is led to this so-called stingy, or what I call a stingy approach to global justice. The alternative view consists in saying, no, it's not a question of what are the benefits of cooperation. It's fundamentally a matter of providing equal opportunities, equal possibilities to all the people who are present in this justificatory community. And so the reason why this kid in Nigeria is entitled to something is not because he's collaborated with me and we have some sort of cooperative surplus, some part of which I would need to give to him. No, fundamental reason is that I have possibilities massively more favorable than the possibilities he has. And he's entitled to ask me why, what justifies the fact that you have so much more? And I have nothing to answer to that. I can't answer that he would have even less if I didn't have as much. And that is the difference principle. I can't say that we started from an equal starting point and I just worked harder than him. It's nonsense. And so, therefore, you have these two views. One that is really we distributed the cooperative, only the cooperative surplus, and that may be only part, a small portion, I mean, relatively small portion of what of Germany's national income is due to collaboration with other countries. Not, maybe a minority part of the whole, but still it's not insignificant. But the other view consists in saying no, and for me it kicks in all the way. We have massively unequal opportunities worldwide. The Greeks, the Bavarian farmers and the Greek fishermen or whatever have very different opportunities because of circumstances in which they happen to be. And this is what needs to be neutralized. That's my fundamental, brief answer to a very fundamental question.
Okay, we have time for two more questions, please.
One point of Rawls in the Law of People is that international respect to national sovereignties is somehow dependent on conditions, on some kind of homework the states have to do within their borders. For example, minimal acceptance of human rights or minimal political participation and so on. If you transfer this idea to the debate on global justice, would you say that what the richer countries owe to the poorer countries is totally unconditional? Or should it also be made dependent on some kind of homework? I ask that because, for example, at least some Germans ask themselves, why should I pay tax financing the Greece if at least the richer Greece themselves are not willing to pay taxes for their own, for their own country?
Mm-hmm. Okay. One more? Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Maris. I have one question, and actually I think I agree with your argument for European-wide social justice, but it's not that hard. I think most of us are high-educated people. So my question would be, so how do we convince those people, especially in the north, that are very critical of these north-south transactions? This is also a bit to what Claus Offe said. So the empirical fact is people are not willing to do this to a great extent. So how would we convince them, or how would you convince them? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. The first question, so of course, for me, justice is not to be thought about as justice between Germany and Greece. It is between European citizens. So that because there is a spontaneous tendency then to sort of in a way personify the various countries, and then Greece does this, Greece does that. Because there are, in order for any sort of redistributive mechanism, whether between political entities, collective entities, or between individuals to operate, you need to have a certain degree of trust in the way in which the whole system is administered. And so if you have, if we had a permanent, which we don't have at the moment, a sort of significant permanent redistributive system across the borders of the member states of the European Union, and if in Germany or in France or wherever you have a tax system that works pretty well with a high degree of compliance and with a high degree of progressivity, and you have a significant degree of redistribution happening to Greece because there far less tax is being collected on the rich, this is not a sustainable system. And so my whole argument is here pragmatic. It's not a matter of fundamental ethical principles, which in this case would operate at the level of collectivities. I don't think you can't make any particular Greek or every Greek person responsible for the institutional structure in their country. But of course, you need to take to address in a vigorous way the moral hazard problem, which is present in any insurance system, in any system of solidarity. And that's in part related to the other question, which is that the acceptability of any redistribution system, also to people who are relatively worse off and who are not obvious gainers from the freedom of movement, etc., and the level of the European Union, and the legitimacy in their eyes of redistribution across borders will be related to this trust factor. It's less the identification, the degree to which I can regard a Greek Swiss man as one of ours, and there's this fellow feeling. Of course, the more fellow feeling there is, the better it is, but it's also the matter of not being cheated by them. And so therefore you need, and that's certainly one precondition, is to have a system that's transparent enough, that's properly monitored, and otherwise you can never have a redistributive system even at the national level. So we have in our country, which has, as soon as you have divided public opinions because you have different languages, you have all these cliches about the other groups that get free rein because the newspapers can say anything because about the people who are being stigmatized because these people don't read the press in that particular language. And it goes in both directions, between the Walloons and the Flemings, between the Greeks and the Germans. And so therefore you need to make a particular effort in order to make things transparent, controllable, etc. That's one aspect. And the second thing is that we must see, and we must also see that without this something like a much stronger redistributive system, in my view, interpersonal redistributive system at the European level, we have a gradual erosion of the solidarity within each nation state. And therefore we must have a sort of credible blueprint, as it were, for what we need at the European level. And I defend this cappuccino model. Just had a cappuccino before coming in, but that's not the reason. And what I mean by cappuccino is simply this, is that at the highest level, at the most central level, you need to put the sort of strong coffee at the bottom of the cup. And then above that, you can have at the national level, strong coffee, in my view, would be sort of Euro dividend, sort of firm, unconditional income at the basis of the whole income distribution. But it can be topped up, and it must be topped up in various ways at the national level, or indeed at the subnational level, and that's the sort of fluff and the cream and the cacao and whatever you put on top of it, which is then the most visible, perhaps the least important, but you need this strong basis and this zockel on which all the rest can stand. And so you need a sort of, that's of course more complex, but you need to have a picture of the way in which we need to operate on the European level of that sort, and indicate that it's in the interest of everyone, in the long-term interest, especially of the least protected in each country, to have also this redistribution at the common level. Finally, and the third element, so one is trust and the conditions for trust. Secondly is to have a blueprint that shows that it also supports the whole of the redistributive system, also inside, the more generous one, inside particular countries. And the third one is that if you don't help the Greeks where they are, they'll just come and crowd your cities and fight with the Turks, presumably. So that
It's prudence, yeah.
in all, it's prudence, and it's a sort of redistribution is an alternative to massive migration. And of course, a great deal of migration can be good, but migration is also hard to handle. And so the sort of enormous adaptation mechanism, adjustment mechanism that exists between the states of the United States in the form of migration, and that happens all the time, 6 times more frequently than between member states of the European Union. In the European Union, this migration is far more costly for the individuals and far more costly for the communities that have to welcome these populations. So, and for the less education, and the highly educated don't care because the immigrants don't come to live in their neighborhoods, they don't pinch their jobs, they don't pinch the services on which they are dependent, and they clean their shoes or they clean their toilets. So, but the low educated, of course, see them far more as a competition, and so they must understand that without significant redistribution, and the pressure from migration will be even greater. So try those 3 things and tell me whether it works.
Okay, which reminds me of a important and serious insight that Brian Barry, in his book on culture, has proposed, namely, under ideal conditions, people can afford to stay where they are, rather than being forced to migrate, right? I think that is an important point. Also, at various points in this discussion, I was reminded of one joke of the early times of German unification 20 years ago, where the stereotypical dialogue between the Ossis, that you also mentioned, and the Wessis dominated the scene. And the Aussie says, after all, we are one people. Therefore, you need to engage in massive redistribution. And the Westie says, us too. Right? Wir auch, right? One people, right? Yeah. And so the instrumental use of borders as exclusionary mechanism. Anyway, we could continue this for quite a while. I think you have given us lots of things to think about and to recognize in our day-to-day realities. We can continue outside over a glass of wine or 2. For the time being, thank you very much for your presentation.
Dankeschön.